Chapter 30. The days continued to pass and the stadium neared completion. Beneath, the borough was changing. The light which now fell upon it was unnatural and laid queer textures onto the familiar landscape. The time-softened edges of the old buildings seemed to sharpen, perspectives became clearer. More startling than this was the sudden fall of night. Gone were the long, dreamy summer evenings, when the Swan's patrons took the pleasure of their porter in the warm night air. Now at sunset, the solar cells withdrew into the upper canopy, and for a brief moment the great umbrella of the stadium was edged clearly against the sky. Muttering doubtfully, the patrons turned up their collars to the sudden chill and shuffled back to the comfort of the saloon bar. Old Pete raised 2 fingers, and young Chips peed defiantly skyward. Pooley leant upon the professor's spade and mopped his brow with an oversized red gingham handkerchief. The recent doings had all but done for him. Had it not been for the thought of his upcoming wealth and his agreement with the professor, he would no doubt have taken to his bed for an indefinite period. Norman laboured away long into the nights upon a project of his own formulation, but for the occasional muted explosion or fluctuation in the neighbourhood electricity supply, his neighbours had little cause to complain, and so left him to it. Jennifer Naylor now received daily instructions and followed them as best she could. Her inquisitiveness toward the identity of the borough's big Mr. X grew with each day to become her waking obsession. Omally sat outside his allotment hut. Being on the boundaries of the borough, the allotments continued to enjoy a natural sunset and a soft afterglow. Thus, in the doorways of similar sheds, which formed a picturesque shanty town leading down the natural arc of land toward the Thames, other Brentonian males sat in similar postures, puffing upon their pipes and supping their home brew. Omally scratched in the dust with his dibber and considered his lot. He had taxed his considerable ingenuity to the very limits in attempting to track down the enigmatic organiser of the games, who might or might not be his would-be assassin. But he had achieved very little in return for his pains. He had inveigled his way into the town hall registrar's office and consulted the land register to discover who had purchased each of the Olympic sites. Each purchaser had told him the same story. They had been commissioned to purchase the land on behalf of a third party that had more than adequately compensated them for their time and trouble. Employing a deviousness previously unexploited, he had teased from each the name of the secretive buyer. The name was always the same: the Cailton Organisation. Sensing victory, John sped off to Company's house, but to no avail. The Cailton Organisation was not registered. It was not a research organisation, nor a charitable institution, nor a trading body of any persuasion. It was not listed in any directory, public or private. It was a bank account, a loan, and nothing more. It was a dead end. John turned his dibber in the soil. Anyone with resource enough could have got as far as he had, which after all was nowhere at all. He was almost on the point of giving up when a sudden thought crossed his mind. It was such a pleasant thought, and so ripe with engaging possibilities, that he gave himself a mental boot in the backside for not thinking of it sooner. Leaping to his feet with a wild cry of exultation, which raised eyebrows from the nearby hut-sitters, he mounted up Marchant and roared away at speed. He caught Alison's floral fripperies in the high street just as the big girl was closing for the night, and charmed her out of a bunch of daylilies. At a little after 7, having bathed his body to fragrant cleanliness in the professor's marble bath, dressed himself in Pooley's best suit, and shaved his chin to a manly blue, he set out once more upon Marchant, bound for Jennifer Naylor's. As John roared out, he sang softly to himself a lilting ballad, rich in the pathos of the hard times of Holy Ireland. That he had never known these hard times himself, being Dublin-born and Brentford bred, was beside the point. For when the soul of the gale is stirred to song, then that song will as like not be the one of lament, heavy with sentiment and evoking memories of Erin's tragic history, and the bittersweet times that all but were, the night that o'er Rafferty's pig ran away, and John Vincent Omally. John turned right into Awas Avenue, and suddenly applied the anchors. Marchant slewed violently and spilled lilies from his saddlebag. Muttering beneath his breath, John dragged his bike into the concealment of a parked car and scooped up the fallen flowers before ducking away out of sight. Parked in front of Jennifer's semi was the long black car which had delivered the all but deadly package to his door. Now what could this mean? O'Malley's brain turned somersaults. Was Jennifer in for the chop too, and if so, why? If the car belonged to the Kilton organisation, and the Kilton organisation were responsible for the games, and if what, and if is, and. At this moment, the liveried dwarf shuffled out of Jennifer's porch and entered the long black vehicle. John chewed upon his knuckles. Now was a time for the finding out, an opportunity to learn the whereabouts of the mystery Mr. X. But what to do? If Jennifer had received a parcel, then he had to warn her. Omally dithered. The car cruised slowly away up the avenue. Dink, man, dink! His decision was, however, made for him on the instant he saw Jennifer's Porsche slide out of her garage and turn up the avenue after the receding black car. Well now, said John, and, much after the fashion of the late and legendary, the game is afoot. He climbed aboard Marchant and set off in hot pursuit. The sheer nonsense of a sit-up-and-beg bike pursuing a Porsche did not even enter his head. He applied foot to pedal and made out for the off. At the top of Awas Avenue, Jennifer turned right. Pleased with this at least, Omally followed. He could see the long black car in the middle distance turning left toward the football ground, and spoke honeyed words of bribery to Marchant. Promises of a new back light and aluminium pump were duly made. The bike was evidently satisfied, as when Jennifer's Porsche turned left, it permitted Omally to follow without complaint. As a token gesture, signalling disapproval, it did, however, let John do all the work, and by the time he passed Griffin Park, he was already working up a healthy sweat. Across Brentford went the little convoy, Omally riding drag in a fervour of pressing pedals, left at the traffic lights and up the Kew Road towards the Chiswick roundabout. As John applied his best feet forward, the thought that the Kilton organisation's headquarters might well be somewhere to the east of London, in Penge, or some other far-flung outpost of the civilised world, took the opportunity to cross his mind. Such matters did not bear thinking about, so he plodded on. The black car took yet another left turn and entered the new estate to the rear of the great gasometer. Omally pulled up at the corner and took a breather, rolled and lit a cigarette. To his knowledge, there was no other road in or out of there, but then where was the black car heading? Delivering another bomb? In the distance, the Memorial Library clock struck the half-hour. Above, a drone of engines announced the arrival of further sections to the nearly complete Star Stadium. Omally took a final drag and flicked his butt end into the road. He had two choices: stay where he was or go looking. He cocked a pedal, hanging about on the off chance he had never been this way, ploughed on. John entered the new estate. He knew little about this area now, although it had been his home when a lad. The streets of Victorian houses had gone the way of all flesh, beneath the bulldozer's plough, and in their place went up the gaunt, flat blocks, built by folk who cared little, to house strangers who cared even less. The place was now a wasteland, poorly designed and indifferently constructed. The dwellings were already beginning to sag and crumble, and the Brentford Council feared daily a disaster of Babel Tower proportions. As irony would have it, residences similar to those demolished were now commanding huge sums in nearby Chiswick and Ealing. But is it not written in the Book of Ultimate Truths that those who can predict the future rarely work for the town planning department? Omally pushed foot upon pedal and entered the twilight zone. It was seedy and fly-blown and haunted. Graffiti covered each and every wall in indecipherable hieroglyphics. Ruined cars stood upon stacked bricks, and in the crepuscular glow of a single street lamp, a knot of ne'er-do-wells, clad in the style of post-Holocaust chic, eyed him with evident hostility. Omally hunched his shoulders, shivered and cycled on, oppressed and depressed. This wasn't Brentford. He might as well be on the moon. John's thoughts now turned sorely to the welfare of Jennifer Naylor. What had become of her? He swung in clockwise circles about the flat blocks, weaving through the dereliction and waste, but there was no sign of her Porsche or of the long black car which had preceded it into this hinterland of urban decay. John halted beside the high wire fence which guarded the perimeters of the gasometer. He would have to check the underground car parks next, and he did not relish the thought. Even Mad Max himself might have his doubts in that neck of the woods. Suddenly John heard a cry, a woman's scream. He strained his hearing, tense and alert. Another cry, and it came from beyond the fence, somewhere near the great gasometer. He leapt from his bike and thrust it against the fence, thinking to shin up from it and over. There was a crackle of blue fire, and he found himself upon the ground, intimately entangled in his bicycle frame. John disengaged himself and struggled to his feet, cursing, spitting, and nursing his singed fingertips. His ears rang and blood pounded in his temples. There was a strange metallic taste in his mouth. The fence was electrified. Blowing on his fingers, John mounted up and cycled on, seeking an entrance. He had not travelled 100 yards before he espied Jennifer's Porsche through the wire, parked up close to the gasometer. The driver's door hung open. Jennifer was nowhere to be seen. Omally became frantic. He pedalled on and on, around and around. The fence was endless. There was no entrance to be found. Within a few brief minutes he was back where he started. "Now that," said John Omally, "I do not like one little bit." He cocked an ear, but the night was now silent, now dark, black, and silent. Logic and reason presented him with a united front. If the Porsche got in, then there had to be an entrance. That, however, was as far as logic and reason were prepared to go on the matter. "Damn," said John. "Damn and blast." Now there is more than one way to skin a cat. Not that John had ever seen any technique demonstrated to pleasing effect, yet it followed somehow that there must be more than one way to best an electric fence some 15 feet in height. Omally viewed the fence. He viewed Marchant. He viewed himself. Again he viewed Marchant. The bicycle nuzzled against him, as if to say, "Please don't do what I think you're going to do." Omally viewed the fence once more. "I'm sorry," he said to Marchant. It was not the work of a moment. It was a right old kerfuffle. Omally struggled to remove Marchant's tyres. Marchant was not at all keen, and by the time the tyres had been forcibly removed, Omally was somewhat bloody about the fingers' ends. Wrapping the rubber tyres about his hands to insulate him from the electrical charge, Omally scaled the wire fence. He dropped down inside the gasometer's enclosure, scrunched Marchant's tyres into his jacket pockets, and brandished his bicycle pump. Then, in a manner much beloved of the SAS, he scuttled forward from vantage point to vantage point, cover to cover. He crept up behind Jennifer's Porsche. It was abandoned. He skirted the outbuildings, prying into windows, keyhole peering. There was nothing. Upon numb legs he approached the great gasometer, the vast cylinder of Victorian iron, which was the borough's most famous landmark, spread before him. John had never been so close to it before, and had never realised how large it really was. The thing was enormous. An iron stairway led up towards the catwalks and gantries which encircled it, and John could think of nothing better to do than climb to a suitable height and see what might be seen. He grasped the handrail and learned almost at once the error of his decision. If the fence was hot, then this was cold, and impossibly cold to boot. Omally recoiled with a pained gasp, breathing warmth onto his now sub-zero palm. He knew that gas under pressure drops in temperature, but this was ridiculous. Something very wrong was going on around here, and he was up to his neck in it. Chancing that the cold might take some time to penetrate the patent air soles of his Dr. Martens, he thrust his hands into his pockets and stepped lightly up the staircase. He gained the first catwalk and skipped nimbly along it, surveying the landscape below and keeping a weather eye open for trouble. All was silent, dark, unfathomable. He approached the second stairway, breathing heavily. Suddenly there was a rumbling sound up beneath him, a grinding of gears, noises of iron in motion. Omally flattened himself against the iron wall, cursing as the back of his head made contact with arctic metal. Below, a heavy section of gasometer slid aside, and a sharp white light floodlit an area of wasteland before it, spreading out in a broad fan. Omally craned forward to look, leaving a tuft of his hair fastened to the frozen iron like an Indian trophy. Below him a figure left the iron fortress and strode into view. It was Jennifer Naylor. Omally watched her as she walked to her car, tall, erect, magnificent. She seated herself, slammed shut the door, keyed the engine and roared away. Before her, a section of the fence momentarily dissolved as the car passed through it, to reform almost on the instant. Gears ground, metal moved, and the light snapped away, leaving John in shivering darkness. He had seen enough, much more than enough. Without a second thought, he dashed back along the catwalk, down the staircase, across the compound, and left the area in the manner by which he had entered.